make it look like a suicide. And sometimes it's not that easy to tell. So this is debated in courts. Was it a suicide? Was it homicide? It's also debated for other reasons too. For example, a suicide might not be able to get life insurance because the person kills himself. I mean, that's, kind of not fair for the life insurance companies. Anyway, so whether it's suicide or not is also debated in courts. And so the person doing the autopsy or the forensic examination has got to be very clear, has got to explain exactly why they're coming out with, let's say, the conclusion that it was a suicide, that the manner of death was a suicide. If there is, sometimes there are doubts, or they're not sure it's a suicide, in that case it's either accidental or undetermined, but we'll get to those soon. When there's a suicide, it's very important to get a psychological profile, because almost by definition, mentally normal people, do not commit suicide. Mentally normal people, sort of like defined as people who are comfortable with their existence, or comfortable enough, are not going to kill themselves. So there's got to be some psychological profile, something that sort of makes it believable that it was a suicide. And again, there's a suicide and it's known that it's a suicide, you must look for a suicide note, because the vast majority of suicides come with a suicide note, like a last message for the world before dying, before killing oneself, or whatever. If a weapon was used, let's say a person died by suicide with a gun, well, what happened? Why is there no gun? Maybe it wasn't a suicide. So if a weapon is used, it's got to be around, because the one who killed himself didn't get rid of it because they were dead. Oh yeah, we have accidental, which is defined as death when there was absolutely no intent to cause any harm. This is again debated in courts because sometimes homicides are made to look like accidents. So again, the person is accused of a homicide. They'll say no, it was accidental, or if it was accidental, maybe they'll try to prove it was a homicide, whatever it might be. So again, it's important to make a note of what it was. Even if it's considered accidental, even if it's known as accidental, always do toxicological analysis for drugs, because drugs might be a factor. A person might be walking, in the street, and whatever it is, a sofa falls on his head. Now that's certainly an accident, but maybe it really wasn't that. Maybe it was really something else. It wasn't just an accident. Maybe drugs were a factor, and they were partly guilty for that. Could be that he was walking in the street, and you have these workers who are trying to use a crane to pull a sofa onto the second floor, and they're yelling at this guy, "Don't walk there, you stupid jerk!" And he's on drugs. He's in Candyland with fireworks all over the place, and he doesn't listen or hear or care, and the sofa falls on his head. Is this really an accident? Again, that's why we got to check if drugs were a factor in there. And again, things are not always what they seem. It might seem to be an accident, but there may be someone behind it, so it might not be an accident. Let's say bodies are dead in a fire. Well, nobody, normal people are normally fires. People don't set themselves on fire. So there's a fire in a house. Let's say we know the fire was accidental and there are dead bodies there. That doesn't mean it was an accident. Check their lungs. There's no soot there. There's no carboxyhemoglobin. Well, they might have been killed beforehand. So you might call it an accident, but it's not. Things are not always what they seem. So you got to have this forensic analysis. Number 4, natural causes, and this is done by no direct human intervention. Person dies of a disease, or a person, whatever it is, I can't say old age, a person dies of a stroke or a heart attack, things like that, where if you can say it was bound to happen, we call that natural causes. Now, it's not always true that it's like by disease or something else. A person could be drinking alcohol all his life, and slowly this builds up and destroys his liver and kills him, even though the person did it to themselves. Nevertheless, this is natural causes because it's bound to happen. If a person poisons his liver like that, it's bound to happen. So that's also considered natural causes. Now, sometimes the line between natural cause and accident is not that easy to define. Like the person did drugs. Now, is it natural or is it accidental? I mean, the person doesn't want to die by taking drugs. So is it that, well, the drugs naturally cause it, so it's bound to kill him? Or maybe it's a sudden death by the drugs and it was accidental. Even though they took drugs, they didn't expect to die. So this often depends on the amount of time. Like long-term alcoholism, we call them natural causes. A single alcoholic event that somehow kills them, that'll be an accident because that's unexpected. We wouldn't say after a person drinks, half a bottle of whiskey and suddenly gets a heart attack because it depresses his heart, that this is natural causes. That's like, accident because it was completely unexpected. And finally, the undetermined, which in a way is the simplest. We don't know. You can find a body that's been decomposing for 10 years in a field. We have no idea how the person died. I mean, maybe you can tell sometimes, like the skeleton might show that the skull was crushed, but sometimes not. Maybe the person was stabbed and no blow or asphyxiated or poisoned. How can you tell? Sometimes you can't. Well, poison often you can because the chemicals might be left behind, but sometimes not. So what do? We leave this as undetermined. Suicide, because again, a body in a skeleton in a field, suicide, homicide, how can you tell? It's not easy. So sometimes we have to say undetermined. Another reason to say undetermined is where you're pretty sure you know how the person died, but you don't know if it was suicide or homicide. Since you don't know which of the two it is, you can say it was undetermined. That's the last of our 5 manners of death. Sometimes you don't know if it's natural cause or accident. That's what we just talked about. He took drugs and died. Was it an accident because it was a sudden, or maybe it was bound to happen? Here's another example. You have a crime boss, someone who's known to be a crime boss, and he dies in a fire. Now, we don't know what caused the fire. Was it arson? Or was it not arson, and he just died accidentally? It happened to be, so we don't know, so we're going to call that undetermined. And yes, if we know he's a crime boss, that suddenly makes us ask some questions. Maybe someone wanted him dead. In any event, if we don't know which of the other 4, then we will call the manner of death, we'll label the manner of death as undetermined. Here's an interesting case. John and Joyce Sheridan. Now, if the last name was Johnson, I'd be asking the same question I asked about Carl and Carmelita Capolino and say, John and Joyce Johnson, are those real people? No, these are real people. And the last name is Sheridan, so I'm not going to be asking, wondering if they're real people or not. Anyway, so it turns out they died in the fire in their bedroom. They found carboxyhemoglobin in John's blood, so he had been in the fire, breathing in the smoke and the whatever was burned. But it was not found in Joyce's. So it looks like Joyce was killed before she got into the room. It wasn't the fire that killed her. Soot was also in John's lungs and mouth, so we know he died after being in the fire. We also found some interesting things around. Those matches and gasoline, what was left of them, was found in the room. So it sounds like someone wanted that room to burn. They also found $950. Now, I don't really know how $950 survives the fire. It could be they had 950 Susan B. Anthony